It was a cold, quiet night. The officer on duty, Marcos, sat at his desk, the dim light of the room illuminating the piles of reports he was trying to get through. The shift was uneventful, with nothing significant happening in the city, making the clock seem to crawl by. He thought about how nice it would be if time moved faster, so he could head home and get some rest. But for now, he was stuck there in his patrol car with nothing but his own thoughts for company. Then, the emergency radio let out a sharp sound, breaking the silence of the night. The dispatcher's voice was frantic but clear. Unit 54, we've got an active emergency call. Address, Rua dos Lagos, number 47. Urgent assistance requested. Marcos grabbed the microphone, ready to confirm the information. There was something in the dispatcher's voice, in the urgent, almost desperate tone, that sent a chill down his spine. Unit 54, copy that. Rua dos Lagos, number 47. Roger, I'm on my way. He prepared himself for what seemed like a simple call, maybe a neighbor dispute or some misunderstanding. However, as he checked the previous call logs, a sense of unease began to grow in his stomach. The number 47 on Rua dos Lagos was listed as an abandoned house, vacant for years. No records of any residents, just old records of a property in decline. The confusion deepened. How could an abandoned house be sending out an emergency call now? He took a deep breath, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was a system error, some sort of radio glitch. Still, something made him doubt. Without thinking much, he turned on the siren and headed to the location. The wind howled fiercely, and the trees swayed in an almost ominous way. The drive to Rua dos Lagos felt longer than he remembered, but soon enough, he reached the entrance of the street, which seemed empty and lifeless. When the patrol car stopped in front of number 47, Marcos felt a wave of discomfort. The house stood there, imposing, but it looked strangely well-maintained. The windows were clean, and the door, still intact, seemed to beckon him to enter. But something in the air made it feel heavy with an unsettling weight. Marcos stepped out of the patrol car, his gaze fixed on the house in front of him. He paused for a moment, trying to process what he was feeling. It was as if something was wrong, but he couldn't quite place what. The wind still blew fiercely, but the sound seemed muffled, as though the house was absorbing the noise from the street around it. As he approached the door, he glanced around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the feeling of discomfort only grew. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew he couldn't just ignore the call. I need to check it out, he thought to himself, and with an almost instinctive force, he turned the doorknob. What he didn't know was that this simple action would set him on a path of no return. The door gave way with no resistance, slowly creaking open to reveal the darkness inside the house. Marcos stepped in, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing eerily, like a warning. He stood still for a moment at the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the faint light coming from a fragile bulb in the hallway. The place was silent, but there was something in the air he couldn't quite place, a subtle pressure, as though the house was about to exhale a secret. The feeling of being watched hit him instantly. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the sense of paranoia. It's just nerves. That's all, he thought. He pulled the flashlight from his belt, flicking it on and shining it down the path ahead. The hallway stretched deep into the house, and he moved forward, unwilling to admit to himself the growing discomfort in his chest. Each step felt heavier, as if the very environment was absorbing him. pulling him into a space where reality no longer made sense. The house was in pristine condition with old furniture, but carefully arranged as though someone had recently tidied up. There was no dust, no sign of abandonment, nothing to suggest that this house had been empty, let alone in the state of ruin he expected to find. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath his feet, and he forced himself to ignore the sound, focusing only on the mission. The first room he entered appeared to be a living room, with chairs neatly arranged and a picture hanging on the wall of a smiling family. They were dressed nicely, seemingly in a celebration photo, but as he looked closer, a chill ran down his spine. There was something odd about their expressions. The faces were sharp, but the eyes seemed like shadows distorted and blurred, as though they were erased from the image, leaving behind only a deep emptiness. With an increasing sense of unease, he pulled back from the wall and looked around. Everything seemed so perfect, so normal, but something in his gut told him this was just a facade, an illusion trying to deceive him. He turned to explore the rest of the house, his steps now more cautious. When he reached the kitchen, the same feeling hit him again. The surfaces were clean, the chairs arranged around the table as if a meal had been recently served. But the shadows seemed denser than they should have, and the air was thick with an invisible tension. That's when he heard it, a low whisper, almost imperceptible, but loud enough to make the hairs on his neck stand up. Marcos froze abruptly and looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. But there was no one, just him and the house. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more urgent, and it seemed to come from deep inside the house, from a hallway he hadn't yet explored. He forced himself not to give in to panic. It can't be anything, he thought, but the feeling that something was there, something watching him, intensified. He moved forward, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, and his steps led him to a door at the end of the hallway. He hesitated before opening it. The light on the ceiling flickered, casting a trembling glow for a second. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine, but the door creaked open, revealing a dark room, the curtains drawn tight, and the bed perfectly made. The air was cold, much colder than it should have been for a house that seemed to be heated. That's when he saw it. By the edge of the bed, a rocking chair began to move on its own, gently swaying back and forth. Marcos froze, his heart racing. The sound of the chair's creaking ropes sliced through the silence of the house, making the air feel even denser. He looked around, trying to rationalize what was happening. It was just an old chair with worn parts, maybe moving because of a draft, or maybe it wasn't any of those things. But the chair's movement grew more pronounced, and the whispers became clearer, more audible. Now! It was as if several low voices were speaking at once, whispering words he couldn't understand. And for a brief moment, he swore he saw a shadow dart across the wall, moving so quickly that he barely had time to register it. The fear he had tried to ignore now felt tangible. Marcos took a step toward the chair, and at that exact moment, the ceiling light abruptly went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The darkness was absolute. Marcos shuddered, feeling the cold of the house sink deep into his bones. He couldn't see anything, but he could hear everything. The creaking of the rocking chair now seemed closer, more threatening. The low voices, which had been scattered, joined into a nearly deafening murmur, a mass of incoherent sounds that seemed to be trying to communicate with him. With the flashlight now off, he groped the air, trying to orient himself. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the sound of his breath became the only reference point in that suffocating darkness. With tremendous effort, he forced his feet to move, taking slow, heavy steps toward what he hoped was a door. But as he took another step, he felt something soft brush against his skin. It was the fabric of the curtains, swaying almost imperceptibly, as if someone was standing there behind them, watching. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Suddenly, The sound of the rocking chair stopped. Silence filled the room in an almost oppressive way. Marcos didn't know whether this was a relief or something even more terrifying. He knew that, somehow, this wasn't normal. And something inside the house was moving, even when he couldn't see it. With his heart racing, he finally found the doorknob and pulled it, stepping into a narrow hallway still submerged in darkness. He moved forward, his hands touching the walls and the banister of the staircase, trying to find an exit, some answer that made sense. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step, as if the eyes of some invisible entity were upon him. The atmosphere was too strange to be real. He felt that the house wasn't just empty, but that it was alive. Something was pulsing there, hidden among the furniture and shadows. With every new room he explored, he found more signs that something was wrong. Paintings on the walls with blurred figures, moving in ways he couldn't comprehend. Even the sound of his own footsteps seemed muffled inside the house, as if the air was absorbing every noise he made. He came across a door at the end of the hallway. It was a plain wooden door, aged, but somehow it seemed to be the only point of escape. With no other choice, he opened it. What he found on the other side made his stomach churn. The room was decorated in an old-fashioned style, with furniture that looked like it had been bought decades ago. But what disturbed him the most was a feeling that time had stopped there, and not in the usual sense. The clock on the wall wasn't working, but it seemed to tick with a meticulous precision, even without the presence of hands. Marcos looked at the bed, and that's when he saw it. A figure was lying there, covered with white sheets. His heart leaped in his chest. It couldn't be possible. He knew the house was empty. He knew there shouldn't be anyone there. But the figure was clearly visible, lying in absolute silence, as if waiting for something. He approached cautiously, his steps now light, trying not to make any noise. The tension in the air was almost palpable. When he was only a few feet from the bed, the figure moved. With a sudden motion, the person sat up, and Marcos took a step back, nearly stumbling from the surprise. The figure slowly turned, and as the light from his flashlight illuminated her face, Marcos froze. It was a woman, or at least she seemed to be. Her eyes were completely opaque, as if there was nothing but a deep void behind them. Her skin was pale, and her hair was messy, falling over her face in an irregular manner. But the strangest thing of all was the smile. It wasn't a human smile. It was twisted, distorted, as if her mouth had been stretched beyond its natural limits. She looked directly at Marcos, never blinking, and her mouth opened. "You're late," she said, her voice a mixture of whispers and faint laughter, a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. Before he could respond or react, the woman raised her hand and pointed to the door. "You're going to stay with us now," she whispered, her expression blending pleasure and despair. There, waiting, Marcos tried to pull away, his body frozen with fear, but he couldn't move his legs. It was as if something had trapped him there, something beyond his understanding. He looked at the door, and his mind screamed for an escape, but instead, he saw what was hiding behind it. Behind the door, in the darkness, more figures were taking shape. Figures like the woman, with empty eyes and impossible smiles. They started moving toward him, their bodies awkward and their eyes fixed on him, with a silent hunger that he could feel but couldn't grasp. Terror took over Marcos as the figures closed in, and he knew, somewhere in that house, he had already been marked. And the worst part was that he knew it might be too late to escape. The figures kept moving toward him, their distorted bodies shifting with a terrifying fluidity. The air felt thick, as if it was filled with some heavy substance that made breathing harder. Marcos felt the panic overwhelm him, but his body was frozen, stuck in place by something beyond his control. The woman with the empty eyes kept smiling, and her mouth opened once more, but this time, no words came out. Instead, there was a low humming sound, almost like a distant buzz, but it seemed to pulse inside his head. He tried to focus, but everything around him seemed to warp. "You're here because we need you," she continued, her words echoing in Marcos's mind. Each of us is part of this cycle. You were called, and now you're going to play. At that instant, the shadows surrounding the room began to twist, forming shapes that were indescribable, stretching and transforming with an impossible speed. The floor beneath him trembled, and a sense of despair took over his being. He didn't know how, but he knew something much older and darker was at play here, something that couldn't be understood with simple human logic. The woman leaned closer to him, her smile even more crooked, and whispered, "Welcome to our game." Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking filled the room, and an invisible door opened in front of him. Marcos looked confused and frozen at the opening, which seemed to lead into a dark, empty hallway. Something inside him urged him to look deeper, as if an invisible force was pulling him into that space. "Come in," the woman said, her voice sounding like a command. This is the first step. Not knowing what to do, but with an irrational fear taking hold of him, Marcos took a hesitant step forward. The feeling that he was walking into an endless nightmare consumed him, but his body seemed no longer under his control. It was as if he was being guided by a force beyond his understanding. As he stepped into the passage, he found himself in a completely different space. The hallway was narrow with damp, cold stone walls. The air was thick, and a strong smell of mold and decay filled the environment. In the distance, he could see a faint light emanating from a half-open door, and the pressure on his chest grew with each step. The sound of his own heartbeat was deafening, and he instinctively knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, he wouldn't be able to go back. He was sinking deeper and deeper into a game he didn't understand, but somehow, he already was a part of it. He looked back, and for a moment, thought he saw a shadow moving down the hallway. But when he turned around, no one was there. Just him and that dark corridor. With the sound of faint laughter coming from behind him, Marcos moved forward, not knowing if he was heading toward salvation or eternal destruction. The only certainty he had now was that, once entering that house, he had become part of something much bigger, something he could no longer escape. The half-open door seemed to beckon him, its soft glow inviting him into the unknown. The air in the hallway was dense, heavy with moisture and an uncomfortable feeling, as if it was saturated with the weight of a story never told. Marcos hesitated, but something inside him, a force he couldn't understand, pushed him forward. The distant laughter of the figures, now almost inaudible, seemed to merge with the sounds of his own breath, which was becoming heavier with each passing moment. He reached the door and, with a sudden impulse, pushed it open. What he found on the other side was something no human being could have predicted. The room he entered was large and empty, but the strangest thing was that the structure seemed completely different from anything he had seen in the house so far. There were no furnishings, just a large table in the center, with something strange arranged on it. The table was covered with pieces from a board game, and as his eyes scanned the space, he realized everything seemed set up for some kind of game, but a game he knew he could never play. The pieces were bizarre, misshapen, and some had markings he couldn't identify. The feeling of despair that overtook his body grew with every second he spent staring at the surroundings. Something rotten, something that defied the laws of time and space, was present there. He knew the game wasn't just on the table. He was the game. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the space, cold and authoritative. "You're here because you were chosen. You'll be part of something bigger, Marcos. You don't have a choice. Play." Marcos tried to step back, but the very ground seemed to bend under his feet, as if the house was reacting to his movements. The walls began to close in slowly, and the air grew even heavier, denser, suffocating. He looked around frantically, searching for an escape, but there was none. All he saw was the table, and surrounding it, shadowy figures that seemed to watch him with an insatiable hunger. "Play, or you will be played," the voice hissed, and Marcos felt as if he were being shoved toward the table. He had no control over his own body anymore, and the pieces of the board began to move on their own, as if they had a mind of their own. The table, the house, everything around him began to take on a form he couldn't comprehend. He looked at the pieces, and among them, saw something that made his blood run cold. In the middle of the board was a small figure, a distorted representation of himself. Fear turned into panic. Marcos didn't know what was happening, but he felt it in his skin that he couldn't escape this trap. The figure of himself on the board seemed to be waiting for him, as if challenging his very existence. The game wasn't just about what was on the table, but about the very essence of his life. He was being dragged into something much larger than he could understand, something that went beyond death, beyond time. You will be consumed, or you will be the victor, the voice said, now closer, more threatening. Marcos felt a pressure on his chest, as if his very emotions were being crushed. He tried to scream, but no words came out. He was being forced to follow the rules of the sinister game, without knowing what it meant to win or lose. Then, the table glowed with a strange light, and the pieces began to move faster, as if coming to life. They jumped off the table, moving toward the shadows around them, forming an ever-growing spiral of distortion. Marcos could no longer see the figures clearly. The shadows began to stretch, distorted, as if space itself was being consumed by the darkness. The voice returned, now transformed into a guttural scream, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. The choice has been made. The game never ends. It was then that Marcos realized what was happening. He wasn't just being watched. He was being consumed, transformed into part of the game. He was no longer an observer, but a piece, a part of something much larger, something that transcended death, reason, and human sanity. The shadows closed in on him, and he felt his body being pulled, his essence ripped from his very flesh. The game was becoming real. He didn't know whether he was the player or the piece, but he knew that now he was one with the house, with those entities, with the terrifying board. And worst of all, he would never escape. As the shadows consumed him, the last thing Marcos saw was the smile of the woman with the empty eyes, now reflected in every bit of the darkness surrounding him. "You made your choice," she whispered. "Now, play until the end." And with that, the room was swallowed by darkness, and the game continued endless, with no escape. Marcos had no idea how much time had passed. The concept of time no longer held meaning. The house, the board, the figures, everything seemed to have warped beyond human perception. What once seemed like a physical prison was now something far more terrifying, a psychological prison, an endless torment, where he was just a piece in a game that never ended. He no longer knew who he was. His memories were fading, as if being erased by an invisible eraser, leaving only scattered fragments of his identity. The shadows, once moving chaotically, now formed patterns, as if he were trapped in a matrix he couldn't understand. Every step he took, every movement he tried to make, seemed to lead him back to the same point, the same moment, the same house. He began to realize that what surrounded him was no longer just a physical space, but a representation of his own mind, crushed, distorted by the pressure of the game. The shadows, now more familiar, moved around him as if they knew exactly what he was thinking, what he was feeling. They didn't chase him, but watched, waiting for him to make a mistake, for him to make the wrong choice, so that the game could continue. "You are starting to understand," the woman's voice whispered, now deeper, more present than ever. "You will never leave here. None of us leave. We are all trapped in the same game, trapped in the same reality. And when you think you've figured out the rules, the game changes." The game board appeared once again, but this time, the pieces were changing, transforming into grotesque and unsettling things. Marcos tried to ignore them, but the pieces seemed to call to him, as if they needed him to touch them for the game to continue. He knew that by touching them, he would be reinforcing his own prison, but something inside him, an uncontrollable need, urged him to go on. He reached out, and the moment his fingers touched the first piece, a wave of unbearable pain surged through his body. His mind seemed to tear apart, fragmented, as he was filled with visions of other players, others who had been consumed by this game before him. He saw faces, distorted, empty, trapped in an eternity of suffering, as if they were condemned to play forever, never able to escape. Then he saw something else, a vision of the woman with the empty eyes. She was at the center of a circle, surrounded by shadows, a cruel smile on her face. She pointed at him, and her voice reverberated in his mind. "You thought you could escape, Marcos? We all start like this, but no one leaves. You're no different." With effort, Marcos tried to pull away from the table, but the shadows reached out to grab him, pulling him by the ankles and dragging him to the floor. He struggled, but it was futile. The pieces moved again, now faster, more aggressively, and he was forced to lie on the table, his eyes locked on his own figure, now a piece among the others, part of the game. Time continued to bend, twist, and fragment. Marcos didn't know if he was in a nightmare or living in a distorted reality, where every move he made was a play that drew him closer to what he feared most, the immortality of the game. He felt a presence by his side, growing stronger with each passing moment, and knew, with indescribable fear, that he was no longer alone. The other pieces, the souls trapped with him, were waking up, their shadows casting grotesque and unsettling forms. The woman, now completely surrounded by shadows, looked at him one last time. "Welcome to our eternity," Marcos screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the buzzing that filled the air. He didn't know if he was screaming for himself or for the souls of the others who had been consumed, but in that moment, he realized the horrible truth. This place, this house, the game, it was all an eternity of suffering, where every movement led to another play. And when he thought the end was near, the truth was clear. The game would never end. He was now a piece among so many, thrown into the darkness, destined to never be anything more than part of the game. The laughter echoed again, louder, deeper, as he was absorbed by the shadows. And with that he knew he would never leave, because the game was only just beginning. Marcos could no longer tell where his own existence ended and where the shadows around him began. Every part of his body felt torn apart by pain, as if his very soul was being stretched and compressed in every direction. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. His words were swallowed by the darkness, as if reality itself had detached from his body. He was in an empty space now, or maybe a space that never existed. The shadows that once moved unpredictably now formed patterns, straight lines and concentric circles, like they were organizing themselves. But what terrified him the most was the fact that the shadows seemed to have something in mind, a consciousness that was watching and judging him. He was no longer alone. He never had been. "You're just a piece," the voice returned, this time sounding less human, more distorted. It wasn't just a voice, but a presence that infiltrated his mind, pushing thoughts into his head. "The game never ends, and you'll never understand the rules." The woman with the empty eyes appeared again, this time closer. Her eyes weren't just empty, but filled with something indescribable, something that shouldn't exist in the human world. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of despair. "You've been chosen to see, Marcos, to see the true nature of the game. Now, you're part of it, and there's no way out." He didn't know if he was falling, floating, or being swallowed by the darkness itself. What he knew was that within that spiral, he was becoming part of something bigger, a force he didn't understand, but that was consuming him. The voices kept whispering, each word a punishment, each sentence a promise that there was no turning back. "Are you starting to understand now, Marcos?" the woman whispered in his ear. "Here, there is no beginning, no end. Only the game, which never ends. The only end is being consumed. And you, my dear, have already been consumed." Marcos tried to fight against the shadows, but it was useless. Every movement pulled him deeper into the darkness, and his mind began to fragment again. He no longer knew where he was, whether he was still himself or just a shadow wandering in a nameless space. Everything around him dissolved, and he felt the essence of his humanity disintegrating. The last thought that crossed his mind before he disappeared completely was a scream. It wasn't Marcos's scream. It was a scream of all the souls that had been dragged into the game, all those who had lost, all those who were now part of the pieces. And with that scream, he was finally consumed by the darkness, becoming just another piece, just another shadow, in a game that never ended. And so, the game continued, because the moment someone is chosen, they can never escape again.